So good evening, everybody, and thank you for joining us this evening. I'm Charity Norman. I'm a writer. I live in Hawke's Bay, and I have a lot of connections to Wellington as well. It's one of my favourite cities, perhaps my favourite city, but don't tell London that. And with me this evening, I'm joined by three wonderful authors. But before I introduce them, just a quick word about the Ngaio Marsh Awards. I'm sure most of you know the Ngaio Marsh Awards were launched in 2010 by a man called Craig Sisterton. And Craig is a lawyer, he's a New Zealander, a journalist and author. He's godfather of Antipodean crime and thriller and mystery writing. But he lives in Tooting in South London. And from Tooting, actually down the road from my dad, who's 97, has just had heart surgery, but that's another story. From his home in Tooting, Craig Sisterton organises this amazing programme of events up and down the country, often up to 40 events in different libraries, different bookshops around the country, in the run-up to the announcement of the long list of the Ngaio Marsh Awards. So thank you to Craig. All right, so I'll start with Jennifer. Jennifer Lane. I'm sure many of you know her. Is a copywriter and an author whose short stories have been published in journals and magazines all over New Zealand, haven't they, and Australia. And Jennifer's debut novel, All Our Secrets, which is set in small-town Australia, garnered rave reviews and won the Ngaio Marsh Award in 2018 for Best First Novel, which is quite an achievement. In fact, Jennifer may not remember, but I met Jennifer at a writer's workshop in Christchurch when I was in the shortlist for Best Novel, and so I remembered that she in fact won that. Her latest novel is Miracle, which she'll be telling us about in a moment. And I can announce, if you haven't already seen it, that today Jennifer was announced as one of the shortlistees for this year's New Zealand Book Awards in the Young Adult Fiction category. So massive congratulations to Jennifer. Just fantastic, really exciting, and we'll hear about how that feels in a moment. Catherine Robertson, that guru of books, described Miracle as ingeniously plotted, compassionate, and with the best combination of grit and quirkiness. Miracle is sure to become a fast favourite with a wide range of readers. Clearly that's true. So, Alistair Luke is an architect, married to another architect. So I imagine your house is really sturdy. And it's like mechanics, isn't it? The car always breaks down. A Wellington guy from literally forever, aren't you, Alistair? Apart from the usual excursions, Alistair was born and has lived in this glorious city all your life. And a fourth generation Wellingtonian with roots back to, the Dark Ages. And he's passionate about this city's history, and he has his debut novel, One Heart, One Spade. There it is. And the debut is a tough one, isn't it? Huge congratulations on that. It's a historical police procedural set in Wellington in the late 1970s. Really interesting time, and how much has changed since then. Karen Macmillan, in reviewing for New Zealand Book Lovers, described it as an intelligent crime novel that is also partly a historical novel. A compelling story. The characterisation is extremely well done, and it's great to read and have the streets of Wellington come to life. And Helen Vivienne Fletcher, a children and young adults author who discovered a passion for writing for young people while working as a youth support worker. And we have something in common, I think, Helen. We've both worked as telephone counsellors. There we go. We must do coffee sometime and talk about that. She's also a playwright, a spoken word poet, a creative writing teacher, and a blogger. And she has written a short story collection for adults as well, Symbolic Death. And her picture books have been translated into several different languages. In 2008, Helen was shortlisted for the Joy Cowley Award, which is really quite something. And in 2015, she was Outstanding New Playwright at the Wellington Theatre Awards for her play How to Catch a Grim Reaper. It's an extraordinarily varied career. And she has 2 finalists in the Julian Vogel Science Fiction Awards this year for Best Novella and Best Novelette, and I hope we're going to hear a bit about those. Her first young adult novel, Broken Silence, was shortlisted for the Ngaio Marsh Awards. And the Sapling described this book as one of the most nail-biting psychological thrillers I've read in a while, a tense, dramatic read. And I can attest to that, having read much of it myself. So welcome to all. Right, you've heard enough from me. Let's hear from you. Fill in on anything I've missed about you, and perhaps tell us about your Ngaio Marsh book, or any other book you want to talk about. Let's start with you, Jennifer, since you're right beside me, and I can pass you the microphone.
Thank you. Yes, so my entrant in this year's Ngaio Marsh Awards is Miracle, the one that is in the shortlist for the Young Adults Award. And I'll just say the exciting thing is that it wasn't actually written as a young adult novel, but it has a young narrator. And so I'm just thinking this means it appeals to a very wide audience. And it does centre around a 14-year-old girl who is called Miracle because she's born in the middle of an earthquake. She survives unscathed, but her brother never stops shaking after the earthquake. And the story begins just after their dad gets a job in a crematorium, which the community blames for an unnaturally high death rate. And Miracle is tormented at school, and some boys play a cruel trick on her that trigger some devastating events, and her dad is arrested and her world is turned upside down. So that's pretty much it in a nutshell. Yeah, so that's...
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi. I live in Ngaio, so I think I should get the Ngaio Marsh Award, but we don't live. Ngaio's not a marsh, so we'll see how that goes. So my debut novel is One Heart, One Spade, which was written in a flash, really. I had no intention of writing a novel at all. It was like a great vomit, and I sent it to a literary assessor, Stephen Stratford, who sadly, he edited it and sadly died suddenly just at the completion of editing. And as my assessor, he said, this is really well worth pursuing, which my bank account hasn't liked ever since. But that's the way it goes, because it is self-published. It's set in Wellington in 1977 and 1978. It follows the disappearance of a young woman in Wellington, and it follows the 3 main characters, 3 policemen, one policewoman, 2 policemen, through their investigation of that crime. But other crimes creep into the story, which convolutes it a great deal. And what else can I say about it? It was really about the differences between now and then. So that's why I'd call it an historical novel rather than even though 1978 doesn't seem like a great deal of history to many of us here, but it is, and it's about, it picks up on themes of racism, misogyny, homophobia, and also it goes back to that time in Wellington when Michael Fowler was the mayor, and there was a great deal of destruction going on in the city of our older fabric, the Edwardian facades on Lambton Quay, and kind of tries to paint the picture of what Wellington was like, and also paints the picture of what is so different from now in terms of technology. So in one scene, the policeman has to go to a phone booth and he has to have change so he can call somebody because he doesn't have a cell phone. Yeah. And so it sort of picks up on a whole lot of themes. Yeah, I think I've said enough.
Sure. So my latest entry in the Ngaio Marsh Awards is Curses and Cousins. I'm actually not going to tell you about that one because it's a sequel. So I'll tell you about the first book in the series because I think it would make far more sense to you. So the first book in the series is called Familiars and Foes. And it's about a young woman living in Thorndon with her assistant's dog. She's become quite isolated, but has always seen ghosts. So every day she's walking past Catherine Mansfield and Kate Shepherd and several other ghosts of Wellington. But these ghosts have never interacted with her. They've always just been these figures that she's seen. And then the ghosts start interacting with her and behaving in slightly strange ways. And as a result of this, she finds out that her assistant's dog is not only an assistant's dog, it's also a witch's familiar because she is in fact a witch. And yeah, from there she has to sort out the ghost problem.
Oh, that's brilliant. I ought to say, and here is Bindi, but not a familiar.
Well, that's yet to be decided.
That's absolutely wonderful. So that's set in Thorndon, just down the road. Yeah. You know, every subject is equally fascinating, isn't it? And it makes you wonder I wonder where people get their inspiration from for these stories. But before we answer that question, I should briefly introduce myself and my book. So I'm Charity, as you know. And I have 7 novels out. I began to write on arrival in New Zealand. As you can tell, I'm not from round here, and was lucky enough to score Allen and Unwin as a publisher, and I've got 7 books out that have been published around the place. And my latest is Remember Me, which is actually set in New Zealand. Some of my books are set in England. This one is set in the Ruahine Ranges. It's about a woman called Emily. She is in her 40s, living in London. She's a New Zealander, and she comes back to Hawke's Bay, to an isolated town, because she hears that her father has Alzheimer's. And she's never wanted to come back. 25 years earlier, a young woman, Dr. Leah Parata, who was very brilliant and very much admired, went walking in the Ruahine Ranges. I don't know if any of you know the ranges. Incredibly sort of wild and beautiful and isolated, and I live underneath them. And Dr. Leah Parata went walking in the ranges, age 25, and never returned, and Emily was the last person to see her alive. So as Emily's father's mind begins to melt, she begins to suspect that there may be secrets hidden underneath the ice. So there you go. Yes. Oh, who said that? Yes, my... Wonderful. Thank you. Oh, wonderful to hear that. Thank you. Hope you approved of the ending. All right, which brings us to inspiration. So 4 actually, completely different books. Helen, tell us about what inspired this series.
So this the first book in the series came about as part of the Witchy Fiction Project, which we have another lovely member of in the front row. So this was during the 2020 lockdown. A group of spec-fic authors. We were all writing rather dark fiction at the time, and of course that was the last thing we wanted to be doing in the middle of a nationwide disaster, I guess. And so kind of some conversations came up about writing something fun, something light, and the idea came about of witchy fiction. So kind of combining cozy mysteries with a little bit of a supernatural element. So I was really keen on the idea, but I didn't really have a storyline other than I wanted to write something with an assistant's dog in it. That was something I'd had in mind since getting an assistant's dog myself. And when this idea was presented of stories that had to include a witch, the idea of a witch is familiar came up for me. So from there, I had an older plot that I had written very badly when I was probably about 19 or something, which involved... no, actually, I can't tell you that because that will give away the plot of the story. It was basically, I had a really clever way to hide some clues, and I really wanted to use that. And so I combined the two ideas of having this witch is familiar and this mysterious reveal of clues, which I can't tell you. Yeah. Yeah. Yes. So I kind of... that's not how I normally go about writing. I am normally very much a plotter, and I have the twists and turns and everything set out. So this was a slightly different process of going, well, these are some things I want to include. How can I build a plot around that? But it was a really enjoyable process and a particularly good one to be doing in a lockdown when you have a bit more time to be doing it. Yeah.
Yes, lockdown could have one of two effects, couldn't it? It could make people do loads and loads of things and achieve a lot, or we could all watch Tiger King, which that was me. But,
I think I'm the one person who's never seen it. So, yeah.
Okay, I don't know where to begin with describing that. Now, Alistair, what about you? Your book has quite an interesting creation story, as I recall. I heard you when I tend to stalk people when I'm chairing these things, and in stalking Alistair, I heard a radio interview in which you described you at the very first sort of time that this idea came to you.
Thank you. Yeah, inspiration is the wrong word for me because I wasn't inspired. It was more of a catalyst. I was driving for work in a rental car through the Paraparas between Whanganui and Awakuni, and I'd hooked my rental car up to my iPhone and was listening to my playlist on my iPhone in this incredibly remote and beautiful setting with sort of mist in the hills and goats everywhere and all that stuff. I don't know if you've driven there, but I was the only car on the road. It was early summer, late evening, and I suddenly popped into my head memories of a very close friend of mine who was murdered in Wellington in broad daylight in 1980. And I don't know why my thoughts of him came into my mind, but I suddenly started to think about all of the things he never got to see, such as what I was doing right at that moment, listening to an iPhone in the Paraparas through a rental car sound system. And I just kept on thinking about him as I kept on driving. And when I got back home a few days later after my project had finished, I sat down and started writing an anecdote about him, which is a true story, and it's actually at the very start of the book. And I use his first name, which was Miles, and Miles is in my book, and I made him one of the, not the main character, but a very close secondary character. And after I started writing that anecdote, I just kind of kept on going. I didn't know where I was going. I've written before, but I'd never written anything like a novel before. And I just kept on going. I set it back in the year of 1977 at the start, because that was when I was most close to Miles, and I've dedicated the book to Miles. But I recreated him as a character in exactly how I remembered him. And funnily enough, I went to his brother, who's still alive, who's a retired lawyer in Napier, and asked him, I told him what I was doing, or what I'd done. It was a draft at that point, and asked him if it was okay. Because he was a lawyer, he said, well, no, actually it's not. Why are you bringing this up after 42 years? What are you on about? And I said, well, if I send you a draft, or excerpts from the draft where Miles is involved, will you be okay with that. And he was like, no, I need to see the whole thing. And he came back with a, yep, it's great, you've caught Miles exactly, and it's actually a great honour to read him in a script. There's nothing about Miles's murder. I won't tell you whether Miles survives or where else he sits in the story, but it's not about his murder at all. Some of you here might remember that murder. It was in April 1980 on Perrott's corner of Willis and Manor Street, and it occurred in broad daylight, and it was completely random and shocked Wellington at the time very, very badly.
That's absolutely fascinating. Slightly before my time. But Jennifer, Miracle.
Yes, well, this was unusual because with my first book, it took me forever to come up with the title at the end. So for this book, I started with the title, and then I thought, I want someone to be called Miracle, and I want it to be a strong young female. So to have such a name, she had to have come through something quite impressive. So she was born in the middle of an earthquake, and that was also inspired from a thought after the Christchurch earthquake of how horrendous it would be for anyone giving birth at the time, or just the impact that would have. So I sort of combined those two things, set it in Australia because that's where I grew up, so I can return to the place of my birth. And also a discussion with my mum. For some reason she suggested a crematorium as sort of a backdrop, which I'd never really given much thought, so I threw that in there as well and created a small town, and that's where it all came from.
Yes, I was going to ask you about the small town setting in a moment. We talk about settings, because they can often be a character in the book, can't they? Remember Me, briefly. It's often hard to pinpoint when somebody says what inspired it. It's not always an answer to that, is it? Another Wellington author said to me once, we know how to fish, we just have to wait for the fish to bite. And looking for a plot can be a bit like fishing. But if I had to pinpoint something, Remember Me, the father in it, remember I told you he had Alzheimer's, and the daughter comes from 12,000 miles away to look after him. Well, my mother died of Alzheimer's in 2016, and I was rushing to get, I knew she was dying because she had a chest infection, so I was rushing to get home to London, and I got to Hong Kong airport when I had the news that she had died. I was too late, but as it happens, I carried on, and I helped my father with organising everything, and it was a good time for me to be there. And in the course of that, I helped to, I did clear out my mother's bedroom. And as I began to look through her things, I realised that it was a bit like a museum. And she had nothing. She died in 2016. From about 2009 onwards, there was nothing. All the magazines, all the letters were from years and years earlier. And my mother was a blue stocking, Cambridge graduate. She was a classicist. She organised tours around the world, but everything had stopped. And I realised it's because, although she was hiding it, she was beginning to lose her memory and her mind, really. And then I found her diaries, and they weren't like Anne Frank's diary. There was nothing personal in them, but she had written what she was going to be doing. And as I looked through them, I could see they became increasingly eccentric, and she started to use capital letters. And I found at the back of one of them, she'd written a list of things to remind herself who she was. So she'd written the names of all 7 of her children, of which I'm the 7th. And she'd written, I was a teacher, and I play the violin. And she'd even named a little girl, Yanni, who'd come to live with her family in the Kindertransport in the 1940s. And she'd written at the bottom, remember, and underlined it several times. So I realised then that what we'd thought of as Mum frankly becoming angry and difficult was actually abject terror, and that she was clinging on. And so I carried on tidying up her things and all of that. But years later, when I was thinking about what to write next, and I was thinking about the Ruahine Ranges, and we were coming into the COVID years, and I was thinking about people being lost in the ranges, and then I put together the theme of being lost, physically lost, and lost in other ways. So it's not as sad a story as it sounds, actually. But that was probably my inspiration. So we were talking about settings. Mine's the ranges, and I suppose one of the reasons I love doing that so much is that I'd actually come to live in Wellington because a member of my family was very unwell. So I used to sit and look out at the beehive and walk in the botanical gardens, and all the way through lockdown. And lovely as it was, I used to imagine myself in the ranges while I was writing this book, and that was comforting. Jennifer, yours have often been set in small-town Australia. It's a really great place for a mystery, isn't it?
Well, it is, and I guess it also is a bit of laziness on my part, because I've set my last 2 novels in the same year I was born. So, but it's quite a fun exercise, and also I enjoy the nostalgia of thinking about, what music was popular in 1984 and who was the Prime Minister and all that sort of thing. But I also love, I also grew up in a small town, and I love how you sort of know everyone and everyone knows, who's doing what, and that sort of small-mindedness, and it's a bit insular as well, so yeah, I just find it a really interesting setting.
So true. Tell me about it. I live in Waipukurau.
Yeah, my setting's fairly easy, which is probably a bit hard to see at this distance, which is on the cover is a view down Lambton Quay towards the corner of Willis Street, and in the background is the new B&Z under construction, which was a stalled project at the time because the Boilermakers Union went on strike, which is why no one built in steel after then, and they built in concrete, which was proved to be a disaster. And on the other side of the street is the Barrett's Hotel, which is now the AA Centre. The old B&Z, which was the B&Z, on the other side, and the Barrett's Hotel is where I used to go underage drinking with Miles. So Wellington was a natural choice for me because all of my anecdotes that I thought of about my friend Miles was set in Wellington. I knew the city very well at more or less the same age as my characters, and I just, again, going through those thoughts about how much has changed, what was going on in Wellington at the time. You might remember Carmen running for mayor under the support of Bob Jones, Michael Fowler on his crusade to transform the city, and if you've ever seen it, Boomtown Hometown, which you can get on, I think on New Zealand Archives, is the story of that period and about the motorway running through Bolton Street Cemetery, the wholesale destruction of buildings, which is staggering to watch because health and safety was non-existent. There are actually people standing in the street as facades collapse and they run away from the debris. So all of that stuff really resonated with me from the time I knew Miles and I was living in Wellington, and it was the natural setting for me, and I wanted to convey my memory of Wellington at the time.
Must have been so fun to set your book in a city you knew so well and to have those memories.
I don't know how good my imagination is, but if I set it somewhere which I didn't know about, I probably would have made a complete mess of it. I did make some major mistakes. The police go out for a Christmas dinner at the Shepherd's Arms on Tinakori Road, and a friend of mine pointed out to me afterwards that it was the Western Park in the 70s. It became the Shepherd's Arms after they renovated it several years later. And I was like, so this is the second print, and I've corrected that mistake, along with the other things you find as well, which I find really amusing, is another reader pointed out to me, because there's one small scene where the main character refers to the bacon being best before date. And she told me they didn't have best before dates in 1977. I mean, who would know? And then recently a policeman from the time, there's one very tiny scene where a policeman sets off his siren, and he emailed me randomly and said, police cars didn't have sirens in 1978. And I went, what?
Did they not?
No,
apparently not.
Apparently they had flashing lights, but they'd used their sirens too often for bad behaviour. so they'd switch on their siren to go and get a meat pie down the road and run a red light. And so they took the sirens off the cars from about 75 until 1983. Who would have known? Anyway.
That's yes, please do.
Did it bring to memory or bring to mind other things? You know, I mean, you obviously knew what you were going to write about, but did it expand out to a whole lot of other things?
So in case you couldn't hear at the back, it was, no, I think you were on the microphone, but really interesting question actually for all of us. When writing it, did it bring other things to mind? Did it expand what you were going to write about?
Planning on.
And
you didn't. You tell us that you didn't plan to write a book. Okay, you must have had some idea of what you're going to write about. My question is, I mean, we all know about that awful murder, if we lived here then. And while you haven't written about the murder, thinking about Miles, did that take you to other places that you'd been?
Yeah, definitely. My process was, I think, non-standard, though I don't know what other people's processes are to say that, but I, when I started the book with the anecdote, which it begins with, then I invented the characters who sometimes reminded me of people, and then I let them, in a way, tell a story, so I didn't know where I was actually going, but I brought in various settings. Red Rocks is a very major setting in the book, which is on the back cover. Yeah, so it took me back to my memories. Breaker Bay is another major setting in it. Obviously the inner city, and all sorts of other. Parsons Bookshop is another important setting in it, where the character who goes missing, Felicity, worked in the upstairs cafe, which is a building I really admire as an architect, designed by Ernst Plischke. So, yeah, I mean, I honestly didn't know where I was going. I had no idea how it was going to end, and I didn't actually know the ending virtually until I got there. So it was a very expansive process.
We'll talk about that process in a moment. But no, you were allowed to. It's not out of turn. you were allowed to bring it up early. But this is an interesting question: is the process that we all have a different process, I suspect. We will come to that. But first, Helen, you're also your most recent series is also set in Wellington. Is Wellington important to you?
Well, I will admit, setting is my weakness in writing. I'm very much my first drafts are what we call white room dialogue, where the characters are speaking, they're having a great conversation, it's flowing really well, but they could be sitting in a completely white room for all the setting details that I give you. So for me, second drafts are very much about trying to create the setting, and trying to get some solidity to where they are, because I don't know, to be honest, when I'm first writing. So I guess creating the setting, I had decided to set it in Thorndon, particularly because I had chosen to have Catherine Mansfield and Kate Shepherd in there, and so it felt appropriate to pick that setting. And also being in lockdown, that there was a limit to how far I could walk to get inspiration for writing. I think for me, the settings are always not about the big picture, they're about the small details. I will be much more interested in whether there's a spiderweb in the corner of a room than I am about what type of house it is. And so that's how I do setting, is focusing on the small details of a space rather than the city. And I have been criticised for that in some of my books. I have a book set in a circus, and someone did say to me, well, it was a great circus, but was it modern day, or which country was it in? And I was like, I don't know, it's a circus. Just enjoy the creepy things happening at the circus, Yeah.
Yes, that's very clever, isn't it? Because your books are about the feelings and the sounds and the sense, and in a sense a sort of Virginia Woolf, stream of what the person's feeling. So very effective. So you have in front of you, Helen, a book called Dark Deeds Down Under, which is edited by Craig Sisterton. Could you, just before I forget, really, could you just tell us a bit about that? That's a set of short stories, I know. Yeah,
so Craig, who as Charity explained earlier, is the founder of the Ngaio Marsh Awards. So he, a couple of years ago, came up with this idea in collaboration with a publisher in Australia of doing an anthology of crime and thriller short stories from New Zealand and Australian authors. So he approached me and a number of other authors, and the project grew. So there's actually now going to be a sequel, which I believe, Charity, you've got a story in the sequel.
I believe I have.
Yeah. So this, the stories are very varied. Mine is about a young man who uses a wheelchair, who is a serial killer, but his method of serial killing is to make people laugh so hard they choke. So he's he's got all the very carefully planned things of what he gets them to eat and when he times his jokes so that people choke to death. So quite different from the cheerful witchy dog book, but so the stories go from the full gambit, from horror stories to traditional thrillers to supernatural and my weird choking to death story. But so it was just a really cool project. Craig is just so passionate about crime fiction in New Zealand, and so this was just another extension of that to showcase the talent in Australia and New Zealand. Yeah.
Of which there is a huge amount. I mean, and that's one of the things that we discovered, more and more writers. Yes, I do have a short story in the next anthology set in Napier Cathedral. Watch the communion wine and the font. But that brings us back really to process, which we were talking about before. Now, with a short story, I don't know about you, Helen, I find it incredibly difficult to write a short story because applying the process of plotting to something so short is just very different. And you said earlier that you're not normally a plotter, you're normally a pantser. You fly by the seat of your pants.
Depends on the book. I have some that, like Broken Silence, my first book, was the most plotted out thing I've ever done. I had this huge piece of paper with post-it notes cut up into little sections in different colours, so each plot thread was a different colour, and so I'd have these long streams of post-it notes for each chapter with each different colour, so that I could make sure every plot thread, so I could see it at a glance where that the pink post-it notes stop halfway through the novel. So the mum storyline, I've forgotten about the mum storyline. And then you get to, so the circus book that I wrote, for that one I had a deadline because it was through a publisher, and I got to 3 weeks before the publisher and I had no plot. So I just sat down and just wrote and had a word limit that I had to hit every day, which was about 2,500 words a day, and just wrote until I found a plot.
That's like a bad dream. It's terrifying.
It was my fault because the deadline was like the 4th of January or something, and so I kept going, oh, it's next year, and then suddenly it was mid-December and next year was very close. So it's really depended for me on the story, and I think, going back to what you say about short stories, often people are trying to write a novel in a short story, and so you have to have the right type of, when you come up with an idea, you do have to first figure out what it is, because sometimes it's not going to be a novel, you've only got enough for a short story, or vice versa, that you are trying to cram too much plot into something, and changing medium will free you up. I am very lucky in that because I write plays as well as page fiction and various other things, that sometimes completely changing the medium has worked in my favour, and that's what I encourage everyone to do, even if they've not written in that medium before. If the story is best suited for that, give it a go, because you suddenly will find it's flowing even if you've never attempted a play before, for example.
Yes, I could talk for hours about how a novelist turns to playwriting, but we missed another time. Jennifer, plotter or pantser, or a mixture of the two? I'll give you mine.
I'm becoming more of a plotter, because I started with my first novel because I had no deadline. I didn't even know if I was going to finish it, and I spent years just writing. By the time I got to the end, I had to go back and change the beginning to make sense of it, so that just took a very long time. So for the second one, I still discover a lot of what the story's about as I'm writing, but I try and plan a little bit ahead. And then I'm working on my third one as part of my master's at Victoria. So we have to write a novel in, I don't know, it's scary to think, 8 months or something. So you can't, you have to have, I'm trying to have more of a clear idea of where I'm headed. So I don't have to,
So that's a very different process.
Yeah, and that's why I'm doing it, because I just thought, it'd be really interesting to see what it's like just to focus on writing for a year.
You enjoying it?
Yeah, it's really good.
And what age group is that? Is that for everybody?
The book that I'm writing, yeah, and it is quite different because my earlier two have had young narrators, and this one has 4 different points of view, and 3 of them are adults. So so it is quite different, but
yes. 4 voices.
Yeah, 4 voices.
Yes, that's always interesting when you've got adults and children's voices in the same book. Well, I am a plotter now, but like you, Jennifer, I started out as I wasn't a pantser because it was before I had a publisher. My first book, Free and Grace, I started to write it because I turned up in New Zealand thinking I would look after my own children. Oh, and take... Go and get your books now. You're running out of time. Anyway, I was a barrister in England, and I had a house husband, and he's in New Zealand. And we come over to New Zealand, and I was going to look after my own children, and he was going to work. You see, but after about 6 months, I realised I was really useless at looking after my own children, and it was awful. And so I started to write books. So I'd drop them off at the school bus, and I'd wander along the stop bank with this dog somebody gave me in an attempt to keep me sane. And I started writing this book. Well, it took forever because when you don't have a plan, you keep going off all these blind alleys, and it's a bit like making a jigsaw. You put the pieces in the wrong way round, upside down. ages and ages, and then eventually I went to Stephen Stratford as well, and then I edited it, and then it went to my agent, and then I had to edit it. So each iteration had about 50, each line had about 50 ghosts. It had been rewritten literally about 50 times. Never again. So after that, my agent, who is an absolute dragon, said, I want to know what your new book's about. And if I didn't have a proper answer, she would make me cry. And so, literally make me cry. It's just so frightening. And so, but it worked because I never ever went to see her without a proper plan. And she would get me to write them down and send them and make sure it was all. And I have to say, it does, when you're trying to write them fast, it does help to know where you're going. Actually, I prefer that method. But I kind of miss the good old days of walking along the stop bank, children on the bus. Now, time has passed so quick, and I've got about a zillion other questions, and they're also fascinating, but it's probably fair if we see if there's any questions from the audience at this stage, and if we run out, don't worry, because I've got loads more.
Got the mic, so
raise your hand and I'll come to you.
Yes, at the back. Thank you.
Kia ora. Really interesting discussion. Thank you. I've thoroughly enjoyed it. I was wondering, Jennifer, for you, because I'm in the middle of Miracle. I know I bought it a while ago. I know, and you signed it, but I'm just reading it for this event. And I'm really enjoying it. And I love how you write your small town lives in Australia. And I recognise a lot of similarities to small towns here. But would you think, is your new one, is it by any chance set in New Zealand?
It's not at the moment. But yeah, it's funny because I've thought about it. I almost feel like I have to leave New Zealand and then New Zealand would come to me naturally. It's that sort of sense of distance that when I sit down to write, I see Australia. And yeah, I don't know what that is, but I'm sure if I tried really hard, I could write a New Zealand story. Yeah, I will make that my goal.
Make sure you do.
I will.
Thank you.
anybody else?
Anybody else at this stage? Well, if you think of something, put your hand up. But in the meantime, we were talking earlier about editing, and I was mentioning that my first book had endless edits. And we were also talking about how you don't have to do so much research. I think you were saying, Alistair, when you live in a place, there is research about not getting it wrong, whether or not police cars had sirens. So, the process of writing a book for each of you, what percentage of it would you say is research, and what writing and what editing? And are you a fan of the research or the editing or the writing? Helen, should we ask you about that? So, if you had to do loads of research for yours?
It depends on the book. The one I'm writing now is proving to need more research. I think when you have clues hinging on particular points. So the book I'm writing at the moment has a murder. I'm going back to the dark stuff after doing the fluffy things for a few years. And I'm finding when I'm hinging something on a security camera, for example, my dad's laughing because he runs the security cameras in a building, and he's forever getting questions like, so when does it record, and can you access the footage after it's been deleted, and all these different things. So I guess I tend to put in what I want the answer to be as a placeholder, and then I have to go back and go, is this actually feasible? I've got a sort of drug plot in this one, and realising that I know nothing about drugs and having to work out, could this be ingested through food, and could that be an explanation as to how this happened? All those kind of... The more your plot hinges on a point, the more you do need to do the research. when it tends to be more about the setting or those more background details, I'm quite slack on the research for that. And then that will be like a final draft edits rather than more integral ones. Yeah.
Yes, and you said that you tend to add in your setting with the second, in the editing process. The editing process is sometimes a bit like having a black and white sketch, isn't it? And then filling in the colour, sometimes with the help of an editor, sometimes just making yourself do it again. Do you enjoy the editing process?
I think I enjoy the second draft, which is where I'm filling in. My books tend to grow quite a bit from the first draft to the second draft. When I'm getting to the kind of third and beyond drafts, I'm enjoying it less because that's usually the things I skipped over in the first few edits and went, that's a problem for future Helen. And then suddenly I am future Helen and I have to fix the, and getting into the line edits as well, the sentences that just don't work and don't convey what you want, or the bits where there's a particular piece of information that the reader really needs to know, but finding a way to get that in there without it feeling clunky. Yeah. Or bits where you've had to add something in later, but now by adding it in, you've completely messed up the pacing, and now you've got to fix the pacing to make it still engaging to read.
Oh, I'm so pleased that's happened to you too.
Yeah.
The thing with the pace, they say, you need to expand on this character or something, and you do. And then next minute, the pace is completely shot. It's all over the show. So, and then you have to rewrite it, don't you, again? I know. I had an editor who said, my first book said, we need more from the mother. It was about an adoptive baby. We need to hear more from the mother, a young teenage mother who gave up her baby for adoption. I spent 6 months writing this mother into the fabric of the story, went back to see my editor, and she said, should we kill her off? So I did. Editing. And
well, editing, I can say that this book was 5,000 words longer before the final edit, so yeah. But research I don't do very much, but I did find one of our fellow finalists, Nathan Blackwell, he was a finalist in the Ngaio Marsh Awards in 2018. He's also a detective, so he was really handy because I had the dad in this book was being held in a cell, which was quite convenient, but I didn't know how long you could feasibly keep someone there, and it was weeks were going by, and I thought, I don't know. I don't think this is right. So then I asked Nathan, and even though he's based in New Zealand, he could say, well, this is what I think it would be like in Australia, and so there could be a court appearance that he's waiting for and all these things, and he sort of explained the bail process, and so that was very handy. But yeah, I don't really, I mean, like Helen, I would leave little placeholders and then find it really annoying that I then have to go and actually find out how these things actually work. Yes. In a later draft.
Do you find do you have an editor who says, well, how does that work? Are you sure that plane would take off and take?
No, I've pretty much sorted it myself by the time it's got to an editor. Like I sort of highlight something that I know I really have to find out more about it later. Yeah.
How about you, Alice? You've got your own mic. So we heard a bit about how you researched it, but did you have a lot of editing, a lot of iterations and rewriting like me with my first?
Probably my biggest shock was after I sent it to Stephen for assessment, and he said, "No, this is really worth pursuing. I really enjoyed it." But then he told me one of my main characters, who's one of the villains in the piece, is completely wrong, and that you've got him completely wrong. He wouldn't talk like that. He comes up very early in the book, and you'll figure out very quickly that he's a villain. but he's a retired High Court judge, and Stephen was like, High Court judges, retired or active, don't talk like that, they don't do that, they don't say that. So I had to, after the assessment, before I sent it for editing, I had to completely rewrite Geoffrey McEwen, and because you have to rewrite a whole character throughout the story, you have to rewrite all of the ways he interacts with other characters. You can't, because if he said this, someone else would reply that, but if he's a changed character, they wouldn't reply that. So that was probably my biggest shock. I mean, would call myself a novice at this. Research very little, which shows some of my mistakes, but most of it on the internet, a lot of it just purely from memory, and I needed memory joggles, which was from the internet. The editing process itself for me was actually really smooth. Stephen made certain comments, and then I had Paul Stewart from Cuba Press do the proofreading, which brought back another layer of the process, which was really powerful for me, because Paul was probably bringing out more stuff than Stephen did. I think Stephen was quite happy with it. So the editing process for me was easier. Between assessment, editing, it went off the rails a bit, and then the proofreading process was quite drawn out. Yeah.
Right, yes, that's another part of the process. Again, it's this line-by-line proofreading, isn't it? Yes, I'm waiting with my research. I spend, I would say, 70% of my writing time was researching. Each book's been about something different. One was about a transgender woman, and one was about a cult, and the research for that was eye-opening, and one was about pure meth, and so on. But I'm waiting for the SAS to come swinging through my window and arrest me, because I'm actually rather hopeful about that. I put my best negligee on, just in case, in their webbing, because I was researching how to blow up a boat, or what with people on board, and what cocktail of drugs to give somebody, to finish them off, and so on. So I do wait, what kind of gun would use, what kind of grenade you would use. So I do wonder whether somebody is crouched over a computer somewhere, looking at my research history, going out like, we're never letting her back into New Zealand if she leaves. Now, coming towards 7 o'clock. Oh, I can see a hand up. Hello. Let's have a microphone.
Well, just we are talking about research and rewriting and that. I'm just curious, how do you set yourselves a limit of 2,000 words a day, or do you say, I'll write for 5 hours? How do you go about it? I mean, you've got to be a limit, you've got to eat and do other things. So I could see that you could get absolutely bogged down in rewriting and researching and forget about life in general, yeah.
Everything. It's a really good question. Routines, writing routines, really is the question, isn't it? And how, of course, if you may not every day you've got time to spend on writing, but Helen, what's your sort of general routine?
I generally find writing has to be the first thing I do in a day, otherwise I don't do it.
Yes.
So, I'll have breakfast, take the dog for a walk, and then try and write for about 2 hours. That may end up... It depends what stage of the writing you're at as well. Like when you're in that first draft bit and it's going quite well, you can, smash out a couple of thousand words. But when you're getting into actually figuring out the nitty-gritty of the plot, it can be... You spend 2 hours and realise you've cut 10 words and not gained any. So definitely for me it has to be early in the day to make it work. I can do editing later in the day, but first drafts have to be earlier.
You're a morning person.
I'm really not, but but that's. When I say first thing, it's my first thing, which may not necessarily be very early.
No, me neither. Yeah. 3 in the morning, but I'm still up.
Yeah.
Not the other way around. Yes, what about you, Jennifer?
I'm definitely first thing as well, and morning, like I try and write because I'm taking the year off work, I've got the luxury, try and write as much as I can in the morning and then sort of switch to reading in the afternoon. I lose steam after, I don't know, probably 4 hours, I think, is my max.
And you have to look after your back and your wrists and things as well, don't you?
Yeah, so, and I don't want to get to the point where I hate it, so I think I'll finish up now because it's still going well and do something else and come back to it tomorrow. So, yeah, 4 hours is a good amount of time.
So organised. How about you, Alistair? Are you organised?
No, not at all. I mean, again, being very novel to writing a novel, it was quite random for me. I work full time, and so it's mostly at night, and then on weekends and in the holidays, and there would be long bursts and then stop. But there was a holiday we had where I pretty well just was sucked into the laptop for probably 2 weeks. Was it 2 weeks? I don't know. Yeah, 2 weeks, and just like absolutely sort of battered it out.
Yes.
In a beautiful setting. So I have no prescription for how or when or how much you should write. It was just, as I say, for me, it was just like, bleh.
And that's a lovely feeling, isn't it, when it is flowing and you've been immersed you disappear for 2 weeks and whatever it is, and the story's just there in your head.
Yeah, there was an interesting point I thought that Jennifer just made, is that one of the things I found when writing is that I pretty much stopped reading. I couldn't write and read, and when I did read, I only read, on that holiday we had, I think I only read 1 book, whereas usually I could have gone through 10. And when I read that book, I kept on reading it and thinking, oh, that was a stupid thing to say. Why did you write, that doesn't work? And it was by a very famous author, and I've actually took that book to a book fair to get rid of it. And so I actually stopped reading during the period of writing almost altogether, because I found it interfered with my own processes.
I agree. I find it difficult to read while writing, partly because you can see the smoke and mirrors.
Yes.
You know how they're doing it. I need to get up earlier and I need to work regular hours, and being a writer, being a novelist is like a non-stop essay crisis. Certainly for me, there's always one due in, and I remember one time I had a deadline, terribly important deadline. Got to get this novel written, got to get it delivered. We were going on holiday, and I just disappeared, shut the door, and I put my husband's family have this habit of turning up, and it really annoys me, and I want to kill them. And so I put messages going up the steps to our front porch saying, "Go away, please go away. No, really, go away." And but it didn't stop them. And I could research how to throttle a Hawke's Bay farmer. But anyway, towards the end there, we were actually going on holiday to Fiji, and I had to send it before I left. So I sat on a beanbag. I could no longer at the desk, sat on the beanbag while the family ferried me sort of leftover Indian takeaway. And at the end of it, I worked all one day, and I started about 4 in the morning, worked all that day without moving from that beanbag, barely at all, and then all that night. And we were leaving to get this flight, and I pressed send at about 7:30 in the morning when the birds were singing. Do you know what? When I got it back later, I'd done a terrible job of it, because after 48 hours with no sleep, you're not really on your best form. I'm probably never on my best form. So, interesting question. Yes?
Do you ever dream about your characters?
Jennifer, do you dream about them?
No. I sort of dream that I have to write, and I dream around it. It'd be quite helpful if I did dream some sort of plot device, but no, I haven't.
I kind of start to daydream about them. So that was writing in my mind and figuring out what they might do next, and then taking them down pathways that I never would have taken them down, and see where that led, and then go, no, turn around and go back. So not dreaming about them literally, but definitely daydreaming about them, and actually putting them into different scenarios and seeing how they'd react in my mind, not on paper, which I think is a really important thing for writing, to me anyway, which I sort of learned along the way, is I needed to give each character a backstory, even if I didn't use it in the book, to understand how they would react to situations, other people, and all of those things. So I wrote their backstories. Some of it comes into the book, a lot of it doesn't, but you kind of get how they react, and that would be my daydream. Was what would John say to Lucas in this situation, a situation that never occurs in the book?
Well, I'm laughing at that question because part of why I have an assistance dog is because I have a sleep disorder. And so I get up and interact with my dreams. But yeah, quite a few of my plots have come from dreams. And yeah, the problem is you don't dream the ending. Or you do dream the ending, but it's ridiculous. So yeah, quite a few of mine have started from a dream, and both the things I'm working on at the moment have were ones that I dreamt 90% of the plot.
That is absolutely amazing. That's just lucky you. Active, your mind is creative mind active continually. It's a really interesting question, actually, isn't it? Not plots. I'm not lucky enough to dream the whole plot, but there is that time between asleep and awake when you're thinking about what's happening in your day, isn't there? And when I'm particularly around the second draft, my characters become, to me, extraordinarily real, very three-dimensional, more so than my own family, really. Really sorry, Tim. Really, I have really strong feelings about them, and so I do dream about them, and that's pretty creepy, isn't it? Now I think about it. But you know it's coming alive when you actually start dreaming about them. I think that they become part of your life, and then at the end of the book, you've got to move on and let them go, move on to the next one. Or you could just kill them off, yeah?
Or you could write a series. Don't let them go, you could write a series.
Could write a series, yes. That's true, yes. It was tempting, actually, because then there's less research. Now, do we have any further? We should start to wind up soon so that you can all get safely home.
More questions?
Any more? All right, well, I think, given that there's lovely biscuits, and be nice if we could just have a few moments just to chat with anybody, more informally. So I think we will wrap up there. But before I do, I want to thank you all so much for being a really lovely, wonderful audience with great questions, and it's been just fun to share this with you. And thank you to Helen and Alistair and Jennifer and to Karori Library, and to everybody who made this evening happen. Thank you so much.
Thank you.